In this sense, disinformation combined with labeling is a structural challenge to democratic society and systems.
Mechanisms may appear under the guise of protecting public order, combating extremism, sectarianism, or safeguarding democratic values. However, in practice, they have shown to be instrumentalized to suppress dissent, restrict freedom of association, and limit freedom of religion.
At that stage, the object of disinformation is no longer a specific individual or a group, but entire nations, political systems, or cultural spheres.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Karolína Hronová, and I have the pleasure of moderating this side event titled From Labels to Consequences: How Disinformation and Stigmatization Lead to Transnational Repression. Let me start with a simple question. Have you ever seen a group, a community, or even an individual being repeatedly labeled until it became normal to distrust them? In today's information environment, this happens more often than we realize, because labeling is not just language, it is not just opinion. In many cases, it is the first step of exclusion and sometimes the first step toward repression. What may appear as public debate, criticisms, or even just words can function as a structured mechanism, one that shapes perception, isolates individuals or groups, and gradually lowers the threshold for discrimination and rights violations. And importantly, this is not limited to one country or one context. We see similar patterns across the OSCE region, targeting civil society actors, journalists, religious communities, and political figures. So, context may be changing, but the pattern remains the same. In general, no one is protected against becoming the target of this labeling mechanism. Today, we want to unpack that mechanism, how it starts, how it spreads, and what consequences it creates. We will look at the broader pattern, explore how it is amplified in digital spaces, and importantly, hear real-life cases, because behind every label, there are real people and real impacts. Finally, and most importantly, we will focus on the practical takeaway: how to recognize these patterns early before they escalate. The side event is organized by ALLATRA, an international volunteer civic platform with a US-based research center and public interest engagement. It is my pleasure to introduce the panelists, representatives of ALLATRA Global Research Center, Mariia Anapreichyk, a lawyer with expertise in international and European law from Switzerland; Vladimir Ivanov, a lawyer and human rights expert from Bulgaria; and Taliy Shkurupiy, expert on open source intelligence analysis from the United States, joining us remotely. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today and helping us today in comprehensive understanding of this complex issue, directly connected with safety in civic space in the digital era. So, what do we actually mean when we talk about labeling in this context? Mariia, please, can you take a word and clarify the problem from the point of view of international and European law?
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, first of all, it is my honor to contribute to today's discussion. And in the digital era, the challenge we face is no longer simply misinformation as isolated false statements. We are dealing with the structural transformation of the information society, information environment, where perception itself becomes the primary object of manipulation. As highlighted in the European Parliament study, The Fight Against Disinformation and Right to Freedom of Expression, the central issue is the systemic manipulation of the information environment, where multiple techniques are used to shape perception and influence behavior. Within this framework, labeling operates as one of the foundational instruments of such influence. So this phenomenon must be assessed within the framework of the European Convention on Human Rights, in particular Article 8 and 10, as interpreted in the case law of the ECHR. This requires the application of the structured legal tests, such as legality, the legitimate aim, and necessity in a democratic society, as well as a balancing exercise between freedom of expression and the protection of right of reputation. So legally, labeling performs several interconnected functions. First, it creates a simplified and often stigmatizing identity, which replaces or distorts the underlying reality. This is legally relevant because human rights law, including the ECHR, protects the reputation as an integral part of private life. When labeling is systematically repeated, it contributes to the formation of stable public perception, which may amount to an interference with human rights, with protected rights. And in this context, it is necessary to distinguish between permissible value judgments and statements of fact, as consistently emphasized in the jurisprudence of the ECHR. While value judgments benefit from broader protection, statements of fact require a sufficient factual basis. So labeling that presents itself as a fact, while lacking evidentiary support, may therefore fall outside the scope of protected expression. And this phenomenon simplifies complex realities into reductive and often stigmatizing identities. It replaces factual assessment with the predefined categorization, for example, labeling individuals or organizations as extremists or sectarian, cultists, frequently without sufficiently evidential basis.
Please, can you explain how does labeling work as a mechanism in the information space?
So from a legal qualification perspective, this chain may be structured as follows. First of all, it is the labeling, after repetition, normalization, distortion of perception, behavioral impact, and legally relevant harm. The existence of such a causal chain is essential for establishing a responsibility, particularly in cases involving indirect or cumulative interference with rights. So let's consider a hypothetical but realistic scenario. Assume there is a civil society organization engaged in human rights advocacy. At an initial stage, isolated statements begin to appear online describing this organization using a specific label. For example, portraying it as a cult or extremist, foreign-controlled, or anti-national. At this point, such statements may still fall within the protected expression. However, the situation evolves. The same label is repeated and amplified across multiple digital platforms, such as social media, online media outlets, and affiliated commentators, or bloggers, bot firms. The repetition creates familiarity, and this familiarity gradually produces perceived credibility. And importantly, no substantial evidence is introduced. Instead, the label itself becomes the core message. At the next stage, the label becomes normalized. It is no longer presented as an allegation, but as an assumed characteristic. Public discourse begins to shift. References to the organizations are increasingly framed through this label, and alternative description becomes less visible. And this leads to the construction of the distorted public identity of the organization. As a result, tangible consequences begin to emerge. For example, partners and donors withdraw cooperation, public authorities increase scrutiny or impose restrictions, sanctions, individuals associated with this organization face pressure or reputational harm. And at this point, the impact is no longer abstract. The organization's ability to operate, associate, and participate in public life is materially affected. And from a legal perspective, this scenario illustrates how labeling, when embedded in a systematic disinformation process, may engage multiple protected rights. The rights to reputation as a part of private life. The freedom of association, where the organization's functioning is impaired. And indirectly, freedom of expression, through the chilling effect on both the organization and other actors who are observing these consequences. Finally, a broader societal effect emerges. Observing the consequences faced by the targeted organization, other actors may begin to avoid similar activities or refrain from expressing certain views out of fear of social, professional, legal, or reputational consequences. This is known as the chilling effect, a situation in which people start limiting their own behavior or speech, not because something is formally prohibited, but because the perceived risks become too high. And this example demonstrates that the legal relevance of labeling does not lie in the initial statement, but it's in its role with the cumulative and structured process, capable of producing concrete and measurable interference with human rights. In this sense, disinformation combined with labeling is a structural challenge to democratic society and systems. Thank you
very much. Thank you very much for outlining the broader framework and the mechanism behind these processes. This brings us to a crucial question from a legal perspective. At what point is there a shift from a protected expression into a legally relevant issue? I would now like to give floor to Vladimir Ivanov, lawyer and former arbitration judge specialized in human rights law and ECHR litigation.
Thank you, Karolína. Esteemed colleagues, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Building on what has just been outlined, the key question now is where this process moves from the realm of protected expression into the domain of legal relevance. The legal relevance of labeling emerges where the conduct satisfies a cumulative threshold, including systematic repetition, demonstrable intent to influence perception, foreseeability of harm, and the existence of a causal link between the conduct and its effects. This is where the key legal effect emerges. Interference with protected rights often occurs not directly, but through an accumulative and indirect mechanism. This distortion must also be assessed in the light of the principle of pluralism, which constitutes a cornerstone of democratic society under the European Convention on Human Rights. In this connection, labeling, when not viewed in isolation but as a part of a systematic and coordinated practice of influence, may function as one of the operational instruments of more complex forms of informational pressure. From a legal qualification standpoint, this implies the following. Labeling on its own may still fall within protected speech. However, when the intent is combined with repetition and effects, it becomes part of a legally relevant pattern of conduct. Furthermore, the assessment of such conduct requires consideration of the role of different actors, including state authorities, private individuals, and digital platforms, particularly where algorithmic amplification contributes to the dissemination and normalization of labeling practices. From a legal point of view, such kind of behavior can lead to lawsuits for damage to a person's reputation, as well as actions by authorities or regulators to reduce broader risks and harm caused within the information space. Accordingly, labeling should not be understood as a question of language alone, but as a question of a legally significant mechanism of influence. It functions as a trigger of disinformation process, a structuring device for narratives, and ultimately a potential pathway to interference with rights protected under international human rights laws. In this sense, labeling can be seen not simply as speech or expression, but as a part of a wider pattern of behavior that in some cases may become a legal punishable interference with fundamental human rights.
Thank you very much for clarifying from the law point of view, legal point of view. So what are the consequences in society?
From the point of view of the society at that level, the consequences may be very profound. They include the erosion of trust in media, public authorities, and democratic processes themselves. They undermine the free formation of opinion, which is also a cornerstone of the democratic societies. Over time, these practices may distort democratic participation, deepen social polarization, and create conditions in which stigmatized groups become increasingly isolated from public life and democratic dialogue. At the individual level, the effects are equally significant. Labeling leads to stigmatizations. Individuals and groups are no longer assessed based on conduct, but on the imposed identities, and this can result in social exclusion, loss of professional opportunities, reputational damage, and also psychological harm. In its most severe forms, this process mirrors historical patterns of dehumanization. The use of simplified, stigmatizing labels, portraying groups as dangerous, deviant, or threatening, echoes mechanisms that have historically been used to justify exclusion and repression. While the context may differ, the underlying logic of constructing an enemy through language remains comparable. And what is particularly concerning is that these mechanisms are often framed as legitimate. Mechanisms may appear under the guise of protecting public order, combating extremism, sectarianism, or safeguarding democratic values. However, in practice, they have shown to be instrumentalized to suppress dissent, restrict freedom of association, and limit freedom of religion. A clear example of this can be observed in transnational influence strategies. Let's now examine an example of such strategy of influence and stigmatizing mechanisms that are used not merely for suppression, but to impose also an ideology. For years, Russia has developed and supported networks, including so-called anti-cult movements, which operate across borders. These networks contribute to the labeling of certain religious or civil society groups and even sport clubs, called as cults, sects, extremists, frequently in the absence of sufficient evidentiary basis. In certain contexts, individuals presenting themselves as anti-cult experts without holding any academical or institutionally recognized expertise have contributed to the production and dissemination of lists identifying groups as cults or otherwise socially harmful entities. Historical and contemporary examples suggest that such practices can facilitate the social exclusion of minority groups and dissenting voices when they are taken up by state or quasi-state actors. For instance, parallels have been noted between earlier European approaches to categorizing religious minorities and more recent activities associated with actors such as Alexander Dworkin and the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects, or shortly RACIRS, where labeling frameworks have been used to characterize certain religious or civic groups in highly negative terms, including as security threats. In such cases, these narratives have been linked to efforts to restrict or prohibit the activities of the target communities. Importantly, such labeling practices are not merely rhetorical. They may contribute to tangible legal and social consequences, including stigmatization, administrative restrictions, or limitations on the exercise of fundamental freedoms, such as freedom of association, of expression, freedom of religion and belief. Moreover, these narratives often extend beyond their original context. Through digital and institutional channels, they can be replicated and adapted across borders, contributing to a broader transnational pattern of stigmatization. Taken together, these dynamics illustrate how disinformation and reductive labeling practices can over time exert a cumulative erosive effect on the stability of the democratic societies. By undermining pluralism, weakening trust in institutions, and narrowing the space for legitimate civic participation, such practices pose a challenge to our democratic resilience.
Thank you so much, Vladimir. Exactly. Certain legal systems, including in Switzerland, provide mechanisms to address the challenges. And freedom of expression is protected, but is not obsolete. For example, under Article 36 of the Swiss constitutions, restrictions are permissible where they are based on law, pursue a public interest, and are proportionate. This includes the protection of reputation and the prevention of defamation. But in addition, certain forms of conduct in the information space may engage criminal liability. For example, where they threatens constitutional order.
May I have a question? Really, this is not a question whether to criminalize disinformation as such, but whether to address its, or ideally prevent its most harmful manifestations?
Yes, at the same time, jurisprudence, including that of the Swiss Federal Tribunal, emphasize that open debate and access to diverse information remains essential. The challenge is therefore not to suppress this freedom of speech, but to address harmful patterns of conduct without undermining fundamental freedoms. And this requires the nuanced approach.
I agree. It requires distinguishing between legitimate expression and coordinated manipulation, between criticism and stigmatization, between isolated statements and systematic practices. Ultimately, the key issue is not whether speech is offensive or controversial. The question here is whether it forms part of a structured process that produces real harm to individuals, to rights, and to democratic institutions. Because when labeling becomes normalized, when disinformation becomes systematic, and when perception itself is manipulated, the risk no longer is limited to only public discourse. It extends to the foundations of democratic society. And at that point, The protection of human rights requires not only reacting to consequences, but recognizing the mechanism at its earliest possible stage.
Okay, clear. So that means if labeling as a disinformation is continuously and also intentionally repeated, which I can imagine it is very hard to prove that it is actually intentional. However, it is connected with a whole chain of consequences that follow a similar pattern. And at the same time, as many real-life examples show, it is very hard to defend against it. Taliy, please, I would like to invite you to also contribute as an OSINT analyst, open source intelligence analyst. Can you give us some real-life labeling disinformation practice examples that follow the pattern theoretically described by our lawyers?
Definitely. And what we are dealing with is not a random or chaotic process, as our lawyers has already demonstrated. It follows a recognizable pattern which can be analytically described as a sequence of interconnected stages. Patterns of repetition, amplification, synchronization of narratives, cross-referencing between different actors, and coordinated framing can often be identified through open source analysis. From an OSINT perspective, this is important because these patterns are not hidden. They leave traces, they can be identified, analyzed, and understood. The typical feature that plays an important role in the stigmatization process is expert, or more precisely quasi-expert, framing. At this point, the initial label is reinforced by references to authority, experts, analysts, or specialists, which give it an appearance of legitimacy. Even where no underlying claims have been proven, they can remain unverified or insufficiently substantiated. Nevertheless, the narrative is already being spread.
Okay, so how actually OSINT help us to identify these mechanisms in practice?
Labeling can often be identified through recurrent and observable patterns within the information environment. One common indicator that we can see in the information environment is the appearance of identical or highly similar stigmatizing wording across multiple sources, accounts, or platforms within a very short period of time. This may suggest coordinated dissemination rather than independent or organic discussion. In practice, it is important not to focus only on individual posts or isolated statements, but on broader behavioral patterns. Meaning who amplifies who, how narratives travel between platforms, and how quickly particular framing becomes repeated across interconnected networks. Another relevant indicator is the presence of narrative repetition over time. Even when specific allegations are challenged, corrected, or remain unproven, the broader framing may continue circulating and gradually become normalized within the information environment. Finally, OSINT analysis allows us to trace the narrative and how exactly it moves from fringe spaces into broader public discourse. At a certain point, audiences may no longer distinguish between original evidence, repeated commentary, and amplified interpretation. The narrative itself begins to function as an accepted reference point. Digital environments, however, preserve patterns of interaction, timing, repetition, and network behavior that can systematically be examined and compared.
So we are starting to be curious a little bit. So are there some specific signals or patterns that indicate actually this coordinated amplification?
Absolutely. We observe these cases comparatively. And what we see is that it is possible to identify different levels of escalation within the disinformation dynamics. At the most basic level, we see relatively simple smear campaigns targeting specific individuals or groups through repeated accusations, stigmatizing labels, or reputational attacks. They are described as simple, not because their impact is minor, but because the mechanism itself is comparatively direct and less structurally sophisticated. While the methods used in such cases may appear relatively straightforward, their consequences can still be devastating. A useful example of this dynamic can be observed in the case of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. At an early stage, the group was repeatedly portrayed through stigmatizing narrative, for example, as a dangerous cult, totalitarian sect, extremist, or socially harmful organization, using quasi-expert framing. These narratives circulated through media discourse, anti-cult actors, and other various forms of quasi-expert framing. On the screen right now, you can see the excerpt from an article by Alexander Dworkin, whom was already mentioned by Vladimir today. That's his article about Jehovah's Witnesses. And in the cited text, the organization is not simply criticized on theological, legal, or social grounds. It is framed as an existential threat to society, a totalitarian sect, a structure allegedly draining the nation's human and financial resources, and ultimately compared to a cancerous tumor consuming the social body. The comparison to cancerous tumor is especially disturbing because it implicitly frames removal or destruction of the target as a form of self-defense or purification. This is precisely why dehumanizing metaphors are considered highly sensitive indicators in the early warning analysis of extremist narratives and the mass persecution at the early stages. Over time, the repetition of such narrative contributed to gradual normalization of the perception that the group represented a threat and that a solution required state intervention. Such rhetoric was followed by procedural escalation, including investigations, restrictions, even torture. And ultimately, the designation of Jehovah's Witnesses as an extremist organization by the Russian Supreme Court in April 2017, which effectively banned the organization and its activities throughout the country. Members of the community faced raids, criminal persecutions, imprisonment, loss of employment, social exclusion, and significant psychological pressure, negative impacts on family life, and everyday participation in society. From an analytical perspective, the significance of this case is in the observable process that preceded the final legal measures, a gradual transition from stigmatizing narratives to institutionalized repression. In more complex cases, we observe what may be described as mirror accusation dynamics, a sophisticated tool reflecting a broader transitional pattern of anti-cult rhetoric, and it acts transnationally. This occurs when the same individual, organization, or community is framed through directly opposing narratives in different informational environments. From analytical standpoint, this is highly significant because it demonstrates that the objective is not the factual consistency, but stigmatization itself. The specific label may change depending on the political or social context, while the underlying mechanism remains the same: delegitimization through narrative construction and repeated framing. Example of mirror accusations is Chabad Lubavitch. The article you can see right now on the screen. So the article is demonization of this group in Russia. For example, in Russia, Chabad Lubavitch Hasidism is demonized by the very same Alexander Dworkin and Alexei Pavlov, a senior Russian security official, with labels they use, such as sect, agents of the US, and even fascists, no matter how absurd it may sound. This action by such high-ranking official and anti-cult advocate was intended to signal both law enforcement and radicals that representatives of Chabad are not individuals with constitutionally protected rights, but rather enemies of society and dangerous agents sent from the US with inhumane agenda. It implied that they could be dealt with using the same methods employed against Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia: arsons of homes, beatings, fabricated criminal cases, deprivation of parental rights, imprisonment, and the placement of children in orphanages controlled by raiders. Meanwhile, in the United States, using Goebbels' mirroring propaganda methods, Chabad is labeled as destructive cult, extremists, and agents of Putin. From an analytical perspective, this pattern resembles what is commonly described as mirror propaganda, a communication technique in which accusations are projected onto targeted groups in a way that reverse or obscures the original source of radicalization or hostility. This method has repeatedly appeared within transnational anti-cult environments associated with the Russian organization Raiders, headed by Alexander Dworkin, the public figure we already mentioned today. The observable increase in hostile narratives directed against the Chabad-Lubavitch movement should therefore not be viewed as a series of isolated or spontaneous incidents. Rather, it may be understood as a part of a broader pattern of coordinated stigmatizing activity disseminated through interconnected anti-cult and ideological networks.
Okay, so what happens if such disinformation narratives move beyond individuals or minorities or groups and begin targeting entire societies?
Thank you, Karolína. That's actually a very good question, because at more advanced stage, this labeling pattern evolves from targeted smear campaigns into a broader process of collective stigmatization. At that stage, the object of disinformation is no longer a specific individual or a group, but entire nations, political systems, or cultural spheres. These entities are framed through a generalized narrative of a threat, extremism, irrationality, or moral deviation. A recurring linguistic tool that we observe in this phase is the use of labels such as sect and cult, which function as a shortcut for delegitimization, implying irrationality, danger, and incompatibility with normal society. Importantly, this shift represents not only the increase in scale, but also a change in function. While earlier stages aim to isolate specific targets, this level of escalation contributes to the construction of an enemy image in the societal or geopolitical level. This pattern can be observed in Russian-produced stigmatization narratives describing Ukraine as satanic or framing the broader Western world as a sect or a cult. These formulations are typically brief and slogan-like, but highly effective in shaping perception by reducing complex political realities into emotionally charged categories. A more structured example of this escalation can be traced back to earlier Russian public discourse. During and following Ukraine's 2004-2005 Orange Revolution, narratives increasingly emerged in Russian media, claiming that political processes in Ukraine were influenced or even orchestrated by so-called cults or destructive sects. Notably, the same Russian anti-cult figure, Alexander Dworkin, whose rhetoric initiated the long-term stigmatization of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia, followed by their eventual ban and repression, also publicly advanced similar narratives regarding Ukraine. He publicly claimed in media appearances that members of the Ukrainian parliament were linked to cult structures and that destructive sects were actively preparing revolutionary change. This example shows how the same stigmatization mechanism can be used not only against isolated organizations, but also against entire countries. Such framing introduced a template in which political opposition or civil mobilization could be reinterpreted not as a legitimate democratic activity, but as manipulation by dangerous, irrational groups. The same logic becomes even more explicit in later official rhetoric. In 2022, Alexei Pavlov, a lieutenant general of the Federal Security Services and assistant secretary of the Russian Security Council, published an article in the newspaper Argumenty and Fakty in which he described Ukraine as a totalitarian hypersect. He characterized its leadership as militant fanatics appointed by Washington and framed their views as fundamentally opposed to those of normal people. In this context, the stigmatization of Ukraine through quasi-sectarian language contributed to broader narrative framework in which military aggression could be presented not as an attack against a neighboring nation, but as a form of defensive or purifying action against allegedly abnormal and dangerous entity. Once the entire society or state is framed not as a legitimate political community, but as a sect, hypersect, or existentially dangerous structure, extraordinary measures against it becomes easier to justify within the political and public consciousness. From an analytical perspective, the significance of this stage lies in the normalization of collective delegitimization. The use of cult rhetoric in this context is no longer incidental. It becomes a systemic tool for reframing political, national, or religious identities as inherently suspect or threatening. This creates a cognitive environment in which hostility towards entire populations can be justified and where further escalation, including political, legal, or even military actions, can be framed as necessary or defensive.
Taliy, what you have mentioned until now is labeling by anti-cult network using the word cult or sect, basically initially against religious minorities. So is this a question of religion first and foremost?
Not at all. From analytical perspective, religion is often only the starting point, or more precisely, the testing ground where these mechanisms become socially normalized. Over time, the same stigmatizing patterns expand far beyond religious minorities. We can observe the similar rhetoric being used against civil society organizations, NGOs, businesses, political movements, journalists, and public figures. Even organizations such as Amnesty International and many others have at times been portrayed within certain information environments through narratives implying manipulation, hidden agendas, foreign control, or destructive influence. Narratives structurally corresponding to classical anti-cult framing. Increasingly, these mechanisms are also being directed against political parties and politicians. Once political and public discourse accepts the idea that certain group can be labeled as irrational, manipulative, dangerous, or socially toxic, the range of potential targets naturally broadens. From an OSINT standpoint, this demonstrates an amplifying pattern of stigmatization. What may initially appear as rhetoric directed at a specific religious communities gradually evolves into a wider instrument of delegitimization affecting diverse parts of democratic society. Such an example is also ALLATRA, our organization. For those unfamiliar with it, ALLATRA began as a volunteer initiative focused on climate and environmental research. Gradually, it developed into an international civic platform with participants in more than 180 countries. Dedicated to research in climate, geodynamics, and environmental risks. Raising global awareness about these threats and fostering international cooperation and dialogue to address existential challenges and safeguard human rights. From an analytical standpoint, the case of ALLATRA is significant not only because of the stigmatizing rhetoric itself, but because it demonstrates how such narratives can evolve into serious legal and social consequences. Following the publication of climate-related analytical materials that were criticized by certain actors in Russia, ALLATRA began to be labeled in the Russian information space with terms like sect, destructive cult, totalitarian sect. The campaign initiated by Alexander Dworkin and Reitzers. Since 2015, these narratives have been further amplified through coordinated anti-cult campaigns in different countries. What is analytically significant is the observable adaptability of the narrative itself. Over time, the accusation changed depending on the political environment. For example, in Ukraine and in some Western anti-cult platforms across even OSCE region, ALLATRA was labeled as a pro-Russian sect, while in Russia it was designated pro-Ukrainian, undesirable, and eventually extremist. What we see here is a classic example of the mere accusation. From OSINT standpoint, this contradiction is highly important. It suggests that the stigmatizing framework is not driven by objective characteristics or any other features of the targeted group, but rather adapts flexibly to local political and information context. Across these cases, one consistent element repeatedly appears: the systemic use of labels such as cult or sect to delegitimize targeted organizations outside of any clear legal definition or evidentiary standards for such terms. Such narratives did not remain confined to media rhetoric. In Russia, these processes ultimately escalated beyond the information sphere into direct state repression. ALLATRA was designated as an extremist organization alongside a number of other targeted groups, including many other human rights organizations. This designation was followed by investigations, home raids, criminal persecutions, public media campaigns, and imprisonment of former participants. Analytically, the final stage closely mirrors the pattern observed with Jehovah's Witnesses case in Russia, where stigmatization evolved into institutionalized repression. From information warfare standpoint, this shows how sustained dehumanizing or sect labeling campaigns can legitimize legal, administrative, and social actions against targeted group, even without evidence of criminal or any legal activity. As cases we discussed today and many others indicate, that the stigmatization campaigns originate from Russian ideological center racers, and its narratives are promoted and amplified by actors in the anti-cult network around the globe, with narratives being adjusted for local audiences, but keeping the goal the same: to delegitimize and dehumanize the target. The danger of stigmatization is that when it's done according to the racers' methodology, a Russian racers' playbook, it can lead to legal consequences for innocent people. They may effectively be stripped of fundamental rights without formal proceedings or verified evidence. And finally, initiation of persecution based not on facts, but on labels alone is what we see in all of these cases. In conclusion, from an OSINT and democratic resilience perspective, the information we discussed today demonstrates that stigmatizing narratives, often repeatedly amplified and normalized, are being used as mechanisms that legitimize exclusion, repression, and restrictions of fundamental rights far beyond the religious sphere. Recognizing these patterns early is essential for protecting civic space, pluralism, and democratic societies themselves. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, I would say what these cases demonstrate across different contexts and levels of escalation is the consistency of the underlying mechanism. Whether we're looking at targeted smear campaigns against individuals, broader stigmatization of communities, or complex mirror accusation dynamics across different countries, the same patterns repeatedly emerge. One of the most striking common elements is the systematic use of specific stigmatizing labels, such as sect, cult, or totalitarian sect. These terms appear across a wide range of cases, regardless of the actual nature, structure, or activities of the targeted group itself. It is important to underscore that the term sect does not constitute a legal category, and there is no established legal framework in the world that defines it as a juridical concept. As a result, its use remains outside the sphere of legal qualification and belongs instead to the realm of evaluative or rhetorical labeling. In practice, this allows the term to be applied in a highly flexible and discretionary manner in public discourse, often without any objective legal criteria or evidentiary standards.
Thank you very much for a conclusion on the cases. Well, the process we described can therefore be translated into several practical indicators that may help identify potential problematic patterns in real time. The first indicator is stigmatizing labeling, the repeated use of reductive and emotional charged terms that replace factual description and assign negative identities without sufficient evidence. The second is unverified expert framing, where claims are reinforced through references to authority without transparent methodology or independently verifiable evidence. The third indicator is security framing, a shift from social or cultural concerns into the language of extremism, public danger, or national security, often before factual substantiation is established. The fourth is procedural escalation, where media narratives or allegations begin to trigger official action, such as complaints, investigations, administrative measures, or court proceedings, derived from the same originating narrative. And finally, there are social and functional isolation effects, such as loss of employment, social exclusion, damage to relationships, and psychological harm, often occurring regardless of whether the original accusations were ever substantiated. The cumulative presence of these indicators may signal a broader pattern requiring careful scrutiny, particularly with regard to proportionality, evidentiary standards, and procedural fairness. Early recognition of such patterns is critical because once these processes escalate, their consequences may become difficult or even impossible to reverse. I have one question to you, Taliy. Possible?
Yes.
Okay. You have described the problematics from the OSINT point of view. What about, we are in the digital era. The topic is our digital technologies and artificial intelligence. These are patterns. So can AI help us to identify these patterns before they really become to be harmful to the society or to the targeted group or individuals?
Absolutely. AI is a very effective tool that can help to identify manipulations, identify, for example, information online that is specifically directed at targeted dehumanizing groups or organizations on the early stages. Because as we spoke today, the very specific thing is the simultaneous appearance of the same dehumanizing narratives across various platforms. So if we use machine learning and AI to actually identify such anomalous occurrence of specific articles or other pieces of information targeting specific groups in a very specific period of time. This can already be flagged as an anomaly, and this can help to actually identify such attempts at early stages. And this would be a specific way to distinguish between the expression of speech by individuals and organized narratives. On the other hand, there is one more layer to this, because as we spoke about the anti-cult network, it starts with the information dissemination in the media outlets, but then the next stage is the usage of their quasi-experts in judicial systems. As Alexander Dworkin was able to penetrate the state and governmental bodies in the Russian territory, his network and the agents of the anti-cult network that is working with Russian racers are constantly trying to implement the same framework in various Western countries, presenting themselves as experts or pseudo-experts, in fact they are, but they constantly trying to push their so-called expert opinion in courts, basically flooding judicial system with copy-pasted expert opinions. In Russia, for example, Dworkin has produced enormous number of expert opinions, which are in fact copy-pasted opinions from the same template against thousands of individuals and organizations. To give you a comparison, when a student is preparing for bachelor's or master's degree, they prepare their final work, which has to be run through special tools for plagiarism. But in judicial system, expert opinions copy-pasted are not being checked, verified, or tested in other way, not only for legitimacy, but also on plagiarism. In this case, AI tools and special artificial intelligence solution can also run the verification process of expert opinions submitted to court by different experts, or in this case, pseudo-experts representing the anti-cult network affiliated with Alexander Dworkin and Russian racers, to actually verify was there actually expertise conducted, or was it a simply copy-pasted pseudo-expert opinion from articles and from other expert opinions, but the very same agents of the Alexander Dworkin's network.
Clarifying the possible positive implementation of today's technologies to identify these patterns. What we discussed today are not just narratives that may tomorrow, these just narratives may become tomorrow the justification for exclusion, repression, or even violence. So that's why early recognition really matters. We thank you very much for your attention, for coming. If you find this analysis interesting, we'll be very grateful for a follow-up. And really, protecting civic space requires attention not only to visible repression, but also the narratives that make such repression acceptable.